Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last class, we talked about the Spanish-American War. We started it and finished it, and then talked about America on the greater world stage. This is where, more or less, the United States introduces itself to the other countries of the world, taking us from what's kind of a backwater cowboy nation somewhere in the Western Hemisphere to emerging as one of the most important countries of the 20th century. As we enter the 20th century in episode number 6, America as a World Power. So, dear student, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delight. We have two objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to do these two things. Number 20, you should be able to summarize various views regarding U.S. imperialism. And number 21, you should be able to explain how Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy promoted American power around the world. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 20. When William McKinley took office in 1896, get that date right, he entered office as a president who was an anti-imperialist. But by his re-election year of 1900, he was a confirmed imperialist. That year, he ran against the Democratic nominee William Jennings Bryan. We've met William Jennings Bryan before. He's that Nebraska populist that argued for bimetallism instead of the gold standard in an effort to go increase inflation and rise the conditions of indebted farmers. In 1900, William Jennings Bryan ran again and lost again. Don't worry, he'll do this a couple more times. But Bryan was a strong opponent of imperialism. This was the kind of thing that he was chiefly running against McKinley in this 1900 election. But it wasn't just William Jennings Bryan. There were a number of leading citizens, including some people that we've met already, Jane Addams and Mark Twain and former President Grover Cleveland and even the industrialist Andrew Carnegie. They and a number of other peace advocates enlisted in that cause, calling themselves the Anti-Imperialist League. The Anti-Imperialist League said that it was wrong for the United States to go rule over other people without the consent of those people that were being ruled over. It's worth noting that anti-imperialists were not a monolith. They had a variety of attitudes and a variety of approaches. Some labor leaders warned their union members about the threat of competition from suddenly cheap Filipino labor. And while some people argued that Filipinos and Hawaiians were perfectly capable of self-rule and didn't need American rule, on the other hand, you find other groups that warned about the dangers to America of annexing 8 million people of an inferior race. So, there's a mixed bag on all of this, and when we talk about anti-imperialism, there's a lot of people in that camp. Nevertheless, U.S. imperialism would continue, at least through the first part of the 20th century. Because McKinley's decided victory over Bryan in 1900, because he won so convincingly, McKinley thought that he had received the mandate of the people and that America was approving of America's adventures overseas. Things like the brutal fighting in the Philippines, though, had begun to question that as people, resulted in doubts and the mistrust maybe of American fighting. The treaty that settled the Spanish-American War, while guaranteeing the freedom of religion to those inhabitants of the ceded Spanish territories, that withheld any promise of real citizenship to become American. It was up to Congress to decide the civil rights and political status of these new conquered peoples. In 1901, the Supreme Court upheld this idea in a number of decisions that are collectively called the insular cases. The insular cases are several Supreme Court decisions that we just kind of roll together because they more or less created the national understanding of this collective. The Constitution, declared the court, didn't automatically extend citizenship to just people in acquired territories. Just because now that dirt is American doesn't mean the people are Americans, but in fact Congress can decide. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, they were essentially then colonies, not future states. The Platt Amendment, that amendment in the Cuban Constitution, the Platt Amendment also limited Cuba's independence by blocking Cuba from making a treaty with any country besides the United States. It also gave America the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, and it granted the United States a long-term lease on Guantanamo Bay. In accordance with a special commission set up by President McKinley, the Jones Act of 1916 eventually committed the United States to Philippine independence, but to no date to do that. So we had the Philippines as a territory, promised that one day you're going to be free, but never really determined what day. the Philippines would achieve their independence. We mentioned this in our last class. They would achieve their independence after World War II. Roman numeral number 21. Here I want to reintroduce a character that we've met before, and it's Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be a recurring character for us for a while, and he's a fascinating person. He entered our story as a former Undersecretary of the Navy who left his desk, he drove a desk in the... school just let out. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt had driven a desk for a while, and then he left that position to go lead the Rough Riders in their charge up San Juan Hill. But he would later run. He would be McKinley's vice president. And then in kind of a complicated, convoluted story, William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist rebel in 1901, and suddenly Theodore Roosevelt was thrust into the White House. We'll pick up this story again on a future date. He didn't want to extend European control over the world's economy or politics, and Teddy Roosevelt really leaned into the spirit of the open door policy to extend American influence. By 1904, in 1904 there was a conflict that rose up between Japan and Russia. They're both imperial powers in their spheres, and both of them wanted control of the Korean peninsula. Russia wanted it because they wanted a warm water port. In a lot of ways, Russia's kind of a prisoner of its geography, but they wanted a warm water port for year-round sailing out of. And Japan wanted a couple of things. They wanted to stop Russian expansion. Also, the long story about Japan is that the islands themselves are fairly resource poor, and they're always kind of looking for better resources. So they want to stop expansion of Russia and go take that territory for themselves. In that conflict in 1804, Japan struck first, and they attacked the Russian Pacific Fleet and more or less destroyed the entire Russian presence in the Pacific Ocean. Then they destroyed the reinforcement fleet that was coming in to defend them. Then the Japanese won several land battles and even took the Manchuria province, which we usually think of as a Chinese province, but it had been taken by the Russians, and then the Japanese took it from the Russians, and also taking Korea. Japan was the early winner in this conflict, and it suffered large losses in doing so. And they knew that Russia would be a formidable foe over the long run, and maybe if they got out and got an early win, that they should kind of stop it right there, right? They knew that those large losses, if Russia knew how many Japanese people had died in the battle, that if Russia counterattacked, Japan probably couldn't hold up for it. So instead, Japan takes a different move, and they look at the United States as an emerging world power, and they see Teddy Roosevelt as a person that can go make some change. And so Japan asked President Roosevelt in secret to go mediate peace negotiations, being a neutral third party, to go mediate and bring it into this Russo-Japanese war. Roosevelt agreed, and in 1905 called delegates of both countries together to sleepy little Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Both Japanese and Russian delegates then went to, Portsmouth is not even a significant town today, but it was safely away from the prying eyes of the press. Japan, their terms of settlement, wanted the Manchuria province, Korea, an island that was like traditionally a Russian island, and then a huge payment of cash to go settle the peace. They said, basically, you give us all this stuff and we'll quit fighting back. Russia refused that negotiation, and Russia was ready to go continue the fight. Roosevelt negotiated what becomes known as the Treaty of Portsmouth, and in this Treaty of Portsmouth, Japan got Manchuria and Korea, but no island, and the cash payout was much smaller. For his effort, Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize. It also solidified the United States' role in Asia, and that the United States and Japan would continue diplomatic talks with pledges to respect each other's possessions. Subpoint B. A lot of countries, let's move back to the Western Hemisphere, and a lot of countries had imagined a canal connecting the two oceans and had their eyes on a couple of countries that looked like they were crossable. That would, cut time for shipping and for military purposes. And a lot of engineers thought Nicaragua was really the place to make a canal. It had an easy terrain. There was a large inland lake. But of course, Panama is a much shorter route. Panama, though, is a much more difficult route. There's volcanic mountains and thick swamps. It's, while it's shorter across, it was a much more tricky landscape to try to engineer a result through. A French company had been trying to develop a canal across Panama for many years, but just could never figure out how to make it work. And so when they gave up, they had bought the rights from the country, which was part of Colombia at the time. They bought the rights to this canal from Colombia, and when they gave up, they sold the rights of the canal to the United States. But when the United States and Colombia began negotiating how they're going to have the rights to go carry out this canal, neither Colombia nor the United States could agree on any of the terms of construction, and talks between the two countries quickly broke down. Before the construction could begin, the United States had to get permission from Cuba to do so. And to support that deal, the French company helped organize, now this is crazy, the French company helped organize a revolt of Panamanians to seize independence of that Panama region from the rest of Colombia. Teddy Roosevelt supported this idea and told the people of the Panama region that if they were successful, if they began the revolt, the United States would support their cause by sending in the U.S. Navy to go defend this Panamanian revolt. And with that support, it was a successful rebellion. And the Panamanians returned the favor to Roosevelt by allowing the United States control of the Panama Canal zone on February 23rd, 1904. And the trade-off was the United States gave this brand new country of Panama $10 million. The Panama Canal was one of the world's great engineering feats. Honestly, I think it's still one of the world's great engineering feats. Builders faced tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria, and building problems like soft volcanic soil. And the task was huge, and it at one time employed more than 43,000 workers all at the same time. The canal opened in 1914, and more than 1,000 ships used that Panama Canal in the first year. The Panama Canal was very good for the United States. I mean, it turned out well for us, but it also cost us a few things, notably distrust in South America for decades, even after the United States had gone and paid back Colombia $25 million for that lost land. This is where I want to introduce subpoint D, a term known as the Roosevelt Corollary. Latin American countries had borrowed huge amounts of money from Europe, and Teddy Roosevelt worried that if those Latin American countries defaulted on their loans and suddenly had to go pay back their money to Europe that they couldn't pay it back, then Europe would call for a repossession and come a knocking to go reclaim that land. And Roosevelt worried that European action in the Americas, even in Latin America, would eventually threaten United States interests. And Teddy Roosevelt reminded Europe of an old policy in American foreign policy known as the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine had been guiding U.S. foreign policy since President Monroe in 1823, and it said that any European nations who attempted to colonize or interfere in North or South America, those would be viewed as acts of aggression from the United States, and it would bring U.S. intervention. Even if the Europeans weren't really involved in U.S. territory, we said that that's our sphere of influence, and it's the ones that we're going to deal with. Roosevelt added a new piece to that Monroe Doctrine that becomes known as the Roosevelt Corollary. It was based off a West African proverb to speak softly and carry a big stick. The Roosevelt Corollary said that any disorder in Latin America, even if it's the Latin Americans' fault, it would compel the United States to use the exercise of an international police power. Essentially saying, Latin Americans, if you can't solve your problems, then we'll solve them for you. For the next few years, the United States exercised that police power on a number of occasions. In 1911, a rebellion nearly bankrupted Nicaragua, so President Taft, who's the president right after Roosevelt, President Taft loaned the Nicaraguan government enough money to go repay its debts. And in response, U.S. bankers said, now we're going to take over repayment rights by taking over Nicaragua's customs duties. So when Nicaragua's charging its tariffs and taking in its money that way, that's going to run through American banks first because you're going to have to pay us. They also took over the railroads and the National Bank of Nicaragua. When citizens heard about this deal, they were outraged and they said, wait a minute, so we owed money to the Europeans and now suddenly that money we owe to the Americans and then the terms of the repayment include what? They were outraged and tried to oust the president of Nicaragua. The United States said, no, this is a good deal, and sent in 2,000 members of the United States Marines to go keep the peace. That practice of guaranteeing loans to foreign countries eventually becomes known by dollar diplomacy by its critics, and it was often used on justifying keeping European powers out of the Caribbean. There's a couple of ways to keep the peace. You could give the financial means to prop up a system. You could also send in military means to go put down unrest, and the United States will take a various set of approaches through the rest of our next unit, and really through most of the rest of this course. And I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.